Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today we say hello to Doc Jones. Hey, Doc, how are you doing?
Hi, Eric. I'm great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining. It's wonderful that you have this little GraphQL tiara on top of your head, so we know what this is all about. This is about GraphQL. So, Doc is GraphQL Lead at Open Technologies at Postman. And you're following GraphQL very closely. You recently published a couple of articles. That's the main topic that we want to talk about today. But before we do that, maybe you can give us a brief introduction about how GraphQL developed, how it got started. So where did it start? Why did it start? And why maybe is it so successful today?
So I'll try to keep this brief. A lot of people have heard the birth story of GraphQL before, but there are a couple of points I want to highlight. So 2012, Facebook created GraphQL because they were building an iOS app, and they had a pretty demanding app of the newsfeed, so they had to deliver a lot of data. And in order to avoid making so many round trips over the mobile network, which nobody would want to do, they developed GraphQL to help solve that problem. In 2015, which is the next notable date, Facebook decided to open source GraphQL, which they did. The company retained control over the open source project. And that brings us to the next date, which is key. And that is 2018. We had the creation of the GraphQL Foundation, which is vendor and company agnostic. So the assets of GraphQL were turned over to the GraphQL Foundation by Facebook, and it became community led and community driven. That was also the year that the first the JavaScript reference implementation of a GraphQL server was part of the project. And that helped a lot of developers to be able to adopt and implement GraphQL, or at least experiment with it and run pilots, because they had
Mhm.
this handy reference implementation. So 2018, even though it oftentimes gets glossed over, this is just my nit that I'm going to pick, is a critical year and was probably, short of the creation of it, was most critical in its current level of success and adoption.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that just open sourcing something, but if it's still kind of effectively owned, so to speak, by one player, right? Most major players probably wouldn't want to bet on this one. But as soon as you really turn it over to the community and you have a community that owns it, then I think people feel much safer betting on that technology.
Exactly.
So you're part of the GraphQL working group, right?
Yes. So I have recently joined the GraphQL Working Group, which is the group of people that get together and are actually responsible for producing the spec itself. So most of what I do is listen and learn, but I hope to have a more active contribution at some point.
But you're not just listening and learning. I would say you're also writing. So
Yes.
recently, you wrote a couple of articles, really just focusing on the spec, which I found really interesting because I think in many cases GraphQL has become almost this movement, which is fine, but like it gets a little tough sometimes to figure out which are the application areas, which are the goals that people are having, and what is the actual core, so to speak, of what GraphQL really is. And you wrote a couple of articles about that, just really focusing on what does the spec say. And I like that a lot. And today we just want to go through those articles briefly and really talk about what does the GraphQL spec do. And I think that also will help a lot of people to just understand what is the actual GraphQL core, and that then is also
Yeah,
maybe
I would
something
say
we
I
can
would want to
focus on.
make this point that GraphQL is a query language and a server side runtime. So the server side runtime is responsible for executing the queries that are delivered from the client. And other than that, GraphQL is a spec, as you know. So it's basic GraphQL is a document that describes how a GraphQL server should work. That is when you boil it down to its essence, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. But there are these three different components that you were mostly discussing in your series, right? So the first one is the query language, which is probably the one thing that everybody really knows because
Right.
that's kind of by definition, so to speak. Is there anything specific you would point out about the query language, or would you just say, well, that's probably something that everybody knows, so maybe they should understand a little how it works, but that's not something we need to explain a lot?
I think there are three operations that are key to most GraphQL implementations. There's the query, which basically gives the data in the shape that the client wants it from the server. So you've got the fields and their properties that are submitted to the server, and the server sends a response, much like any API that anybody's ever worked with, except maybe some really early ones that didn't do that. And then there's a mutation, which allows you to interact with the data and change it in some way. Most common use case for a mutation is creating a data point, creating a user, creating some new field. And then lastly, I think one that, some people, depending on what their API style of choice is, may be less familiar with, and that's subscriptions. And subscriptions are basically a way to listen for changes to the data. So it's often used for like real-time chat and streaming applications. So those are the three main operations for a query.
And I guess you're completely right that the subscription part probably is the one that most people aren't maybe as familiar with as they are with the query and the mutation parts, right? Which are kind of more, as you said, like the classical API stuff. I can read data, I can update data, and
Right.
the
Really
subscription
a little
part
more
is,
CRUD friendly.
yeah, yeah. Okay, but still, I guess that part maybe is not all that surprising. But then, like the second part that we are writing about, which already I think is quite interesting because it is something that you don't find, I would say, in such a detailed way in many other API approaches built into the system itself, is the type language.
Yes.
And the type system, that's something that also is a really important part of GraphQL because potentially you have very large graphs, right? And you want to be
Yes.
able to say what these look like. So what would you highlight when it comes to the type system part of things? What is the most important aspect there?
So so the fact that the schema is a collection of types, and it represents the data model. And that's one of the challenges for people who are, in getting involved with GraphQL for the first time, or maybe they have a long career in REST and now they need to adopt GraphQL for a specific purpose or as a gateway. And there was actually a book that was written about GraphQL recently that talked about the number one obstacle for engineering teams to be able to adopt and implement GraphQL is the change in mental model. So the schema and the schema and the types that are found in it and defined in it are a result of that graph data model. So you have, not only the nodes. This is very different than a table system. Not only the nodes, but there's also data that lives on the connections, and those can also be added to the schema as types. And then within the types, you have what you would expect, which are, a series of properties. And then you also have, you may have links out to other APIs or other data sources, or even other sites. So that's the type system also gives you the ability, like types, like languages that use types, Java probably being the most notable and recognizable one, TypeScript as well. You can do type validation, which is super helpful when you're validating a schema.
And I think that's also a really nice segue into the third part, maybe, when it comes to validation.
Yes.
So we talked about the query language and then the type system, and now the third part that you are writing about, that is GraphQL, is this whole idea of execution and validation, right? And
Yes.
how does this part, like, what does it do, and how does it relate to the other two parts?
So let's talk about execution first, because
Okay.
generally it's a part of part of the cycle of delivering data to the client. So you write a query, you send that over the network to the server, and then you have functions called resolvers, which take the value, the variable that or field, I should say, the field that you're delivering, and return a value for that field. So they execute the query and return the results as a response. And 99.99% of the time it's JSON. It could be something else, but most people have sort of standardized on JSON in responses, as as is case with other API styles.
So the execution part talks about like taking a query in most cases and turning that into a response, into a result that the client can work with. Now, what is the
Yes.
validation part all about?
Okay, so when it comes to validation, and again, all of this is prefaced on what we're talking about is the spec, and what the spec requires in order for you to be considered, spec compliant. This is not by any means the end all and be all of validation. There are many ways, to do that. So I want to say that up front. But again, you've got uh, you can do type checking on everything that's in the schema. And then you can also validate queries based on that schema. And most people, use something like introspection to like it's a way of building your query with known properties and fields from the schema. So that's also an aspect of
Hmm.
validation.
So is that, I have to ask, maybe I'm showing my my age here, so to speak. Is graphical still something that is popular in the community? Because I know that like this was, and it was a really nice example of introspection, right? Like
Yes.
allowing you to basically explore things while you're building queries and see what they would
It's
result
funny you should bring that up. So there's actually active development right now on Graphical 2.0,
in.
and
Ah.
it's probably going to be released, sometime close to the time frame, hopefully close to the time frame of GraphQL 2022.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so that would be a really interesting topic in itself, but that would be a different video. Um, but okay, so validation really is that part that allows you to kind of bring together the things you've defined in the type system and the queries and make sure that kind of these work
Type
together, right?
checking,
So, yeah.
inspecting the schema, make
Hmm.
the result. You can add code to the resolvers as well, to validate a query before it gets executed. And
Hmm.
that is, a common pattern that is, security oriented.
Hmm.
So you want to validate that query before it gets executed by the server.
Hmm. Great. So you've written a couple of articles about those things. So for anybody who's interested in going through these things in more detail, I'll link to all these articles from the video description. But I think for today, actually, that's all that I really wanted to talk about, because you spend a lot of time like working yourself into the spec. It's like really making sure you understand everything about it and you wrote about it, which is always, I think, great for the community. So we can make that available to everybody. The one thing that I think would be really nice, but that'll be for, I would say, another time, is to then talk more about, okay, now what can you do with that, right? Like, what are typical implementation patterns? Where do you see it being used, and these kind of things? And you have quite a bit of experience there as well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I
So
think
I think if you look at all I very deliberately lifted all of the examples in the 101 series from GitHub's GraphQL because I think it's probably the most excellent example of implementing GraphQL that I've seen. I haven't seen Netflix's internal network, but of the public GraphQL APIs that I'm aware of, GitHub is just superior at that kind of work. And I think it would be interesting to take a look at their Explorer, which is part of GraphiQL, which you can see all the elements of their schema and how to compose a query from those available fields. That would be interesting.
Okay, well, maybe that's another thing we could do. It's like do a little bit hands-on, basically, looking
Sure.
at like one specific
I might want to
GraphQL tool.
record it though instead of doing it live.
Okay, that's
just,
fine. That's
just in
fine.
case.
Just in case, yes. There's always the
Stand by
edit
for
button
this
then.
video.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. So that's it for today. I think we covered good grounds with just going through the spec. Thanks so much for joining, Doc. That was really nice.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Eric. I enjoyed it.
Thanks again for joining. Thanks everybody for tuning in and listening. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. And that's it for today. Until next time, keep getting APIs to work. Bye bye.